Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Chrysler. Each episode, we talk to business owners and leaders to learn about their story, their business, the challenges they've overcome, and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey, everybody. So excited to welcome Jim Frye from SourceDay today to the podcast. Jim is the Enterprise Sales Director for SourceDay and has helped hundreds of manufacturing companies improve operational efficiency and drive positive outcomes for more than 30 years. Jim, thank you so much for joining us on the Everyday Business Problems Podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dave.
Yeah, so excited to jump into this conversation with you. We are talking about supply chain challenges in manufacturing, and anybody that is either a consumer of a manufactured product or somebody that is directly responsible knows all about the fun times, especially lately, that we've had with supply chain.
Yeah, agreed. It's one of those topics of conversation, regardless of the industry you're in. It seems to be top of mind for most companies today, for sure.
Yeah, it's hard to get away from. So, Jim, what are some of the specific challenges that you've seen in the manufacturing world as it relates to supply chain?
I think from my perspective, and that perspective is one that started back in the manufacturing world for myself. I was a project manager and estimator for a titanium fabrication company in the East Coast. And during my early career, some of the challenges that I faced as a project manager with respect to supply chain, although completely different from the challenges that we're experiencing today in terms of the root cause, but some of the traditional challenges, just not being able to get our parts in time to satisfy our customer demands, right? Every company has a responsibility to deliver on time and in full to their customers, and anything that prevents you from doing that obviously is something that you need to correct. And so I learned very early in my career that supplier on-time delivery performance is critical. As we look at some of the macroeconomic trends and COVID pandemic impact that we've seen over the last 2 years or so, never has that been more evident to me that there are a tremendous number of business challenges that we face, and anything that we can do to correct that and start stacking low-hanging fruit in order to combat some of those challenges, I think is important. Chief among those, in my opinion, and working with hundreds and hundreds of manufacturing and distribution companies over the years, is the need for better collaboration with suppliers. So that relationship that exists between buyers and suppliers in the past has always been very, in my opinion, very transaction focused, right? It's all about doing things efficiently. And I think what we've seen over the last 18 to 24 months is that the traditional approach to that relationship that exists between buyers and suppliers needs to be transformed. It needs to be much more collaborative. There needs to be a fostering of better relationships and confidence in supply. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in my career is the traditional supply chain has been replaced with more digital and collaborative methods.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You brought up a couple of points in, COVID obviously impacting supply chain. I'd love to get into that a little bit deeper. But before we do, something else that you said in terms of building relationships and what those relationships have looked like in the past, as well as kind of what they are today and what they need to be in the future. So I'd love to just get your perspective a little bit on that, because to me, it's related back to some of the things that we've seen throughout COVID, right? You see the Great Recession, if you will, or resignation, if you will, from people. And I think a lot of it is all relationship based. So I'd love to get your takeaway on, that relationship aspect of your supply chain and how you can foster some better relationships and start that process, because I believe it really is a process to change the dynamic of the relationship from what it has been probably for some time and what's been well accepted as a, let's call it, industry norm, if you will. And then kind of what do we need to do to start fostering some better relationships from your opinion?
Absolutely. And I think, just from a baseline understanding perspective, the traditional supply chain, and I'll use my air quotes, when we talk about the relationship that exists between buyers and suppliers, in my experience, in my 30 plus years of working with manufacturing and distribution companies, the traditional supply chain was one that had a buyer and a supplier relationship that was based upon transaction, right? It's a transaction based relationship. Buyers have ordered demands, they place those demands onto a supplier, and they're held accountable for the delivery of those goods and services. And I think what I've seen in my career is a transformation of almost an adversarial relationship there, to one that I think the best companies in the world today have a collaborative approach in which there is trust and communication at a very high frequency to foster better relationships between the two. So it can be a win-win situation when we're talking about sending those demand signals to our suppliers. Anything that we can do to provide and foster better relationships is going to translate from a business perspective to more on-time delivery, for one, and that's critically important, of course, but also that enables suppliers to perhaps have a more favorable pricing structure for buyers, right? When you have that relationship that's improving, the confidence, the accuracy is improving, and that level of communication is such that it really helps foster a better relationship between two organizations. It's not just a buying and selling role that you're working with there.
I really like that. It reminds me of some conversations I would have. I used to work for a publicly traded company that would grow through acquisition. And when we would acquire a facility, from time to time, I'd be tasked with mentoring the leadership team. And throughout those conversations, inevitably, you would hear things like, well, so-and-so out on the shop floor, they're just not pulling their weight. They're just not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And you'd have this kind of adversarial relationship, right? And what you said really reminds me of that. And the point I used to try to make, and what jumped into my mind with what you said, is the fact that a supplier doesn't want to do a bad job for you. Okay. They just don't. That's their whole business, is to
Absolutely.
support you. And so by fostering that relationship, by making things win-win, by making them, non-adversarial, by understanding the give and take, the ebb and flow, the relationship, how they need to operate and work within their own constraints, and how that impacts you, having those open dialogues and communications, right? That is what's going to really propel things forward. It's not this thought process of it's us against them. And if you have that thought process, you're really going to struggle, I think, to improve the relationships, one, but two, to make sure that you are able to deliver on the promises for your own customers.
That open dialogue is critically important, and one of the ways that I've seen organizations improve that relationship is by having not only an open dialogue but sharing expectations in terms of performance measurement, right? What does great look like? And so once that's established, once that bar has been set between buyers and suppliers, and the open dialogue is available to them, I see a much better outcome for both organizations, frankly. And you look at this from the perspective, I think back at the early part of my career, back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was in the project management role, it was very much here's what we need, here's when we need it. You can't do it, we'll find someone else that can. Well, that is really not the best way to do business. And I think, by setting those expectations and managing performance, sharing expectations for that different performance levels, I think is critically important and goes a long way to fostering those relationships.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Let's dig a little bit into, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think it at some point is kind of obvious, but I do want to talk about the impact that COVID has had on supply chain, on the challenges, and, kind of also how that ultimately relates out to customer facing, delivery and challenges that are in the marketplace today.
Absolutely. And I think that discussion starts with the identification of what manufacturing and distribution companies are in business to do, right? And that is to deliver on time, in full to their to their customers. And so in order to support that, I think it's critically important to understand the impact of on-time delivery from the supplier, right? Because everything has a linear path from the supply chain, right? So if we start with the supplier, and let's assume for a moment that a supplier is not able to deliver on time to the manufacturing organization. Well, in turn, that manufacturing organization is not able to produce products on time. They can't ship on time, they can't invoice on time, and nor can they recognize revenue. And of course, now we're talking about some big picture business outcomes that are affected by a potentially less than 100% on-time delivery from the supplier base. So we talk about revenue protection, customer order protection, essentially. And if that's a critical element to any manufacturing or distribution business, we need to get our handle around that, right? We need to make sure that we're taking steps necessary to improve the on-time delivery performance of those suppliers. And if you subscribe to the earlier comments around building better relationships and fostering those relationships between buyers and suppliers, then there needs to be two-way communication. And I'm going off on a slightly tangential comment here, but my thought process on that is that we have over time, from a manufacturing and distribution perspective, there have been tools that we can use, material requirements planning, of course, to set the stage for demand signals that we then share with our suppliers to fulfill. Those traditional approaches are very much a read and react type of tool. Back to your original question with respect to the impact of COVID and what we're doing to combat that, what we've seen at SourceDay over the last 2 years or so is that during normal times, you're going to have purchase order changes at a magnitude of 52% roughly over that period based on our existing customer base. During the beginnings, I would say 6 to 9 months of the pandemic, that number rose to the high 68, 69%. So
Wow.
what does that mean to the typical manufacturing company? If the purchase orders are changing at that level and that frequency, then the corresponding management of those demand signals requires more communication with suppliers. The changes that occur over that period of time need to be communicated and acknowledged back from the suppliers. And that leaves most organizations with a very high quantity of communication points right along the way of those changing purchase orders. And so I think if you tie this to the traditional, what has been done historically to automate that process of communication? Well, some organizations subscribe to EDI processes, right? And they'll have typically it's a one directional communication where the demand is communicated to the supplier fulfills demand, and it's done electronically in the background. And it's usually resolved with the top handful of suppliers for any given manufacturing or distribution company. And so what we've done, I'll throw in a little SourceDay plug here, from a supply and demand perspective, what SourceDay is in business to do and is purpose built to manage is the bidirectional communication frequency associated with purchase orders. So if they're changing at a high level, then we need to be able to communicate those changes and acknowledgements in a bidirectional type of perspective so that we have higher accuracy, higher velocity of communication, and that higher velocity and higher accuracy usually translates to fostering better relationships between the buyers and suppliers because we're setting and maintaining those expectations.
Yeah, I really like that. Kind of from my experience, right? Too often, what has happened when you don't have access to a tool like this, or you backfill in with some other tools that are available. To your point about the EDI exchange, what do? We fill the gap with people, right? And while that can work in some cases, it often just adds an additional layer of complexity. And in my opinion, being an operations person, a systems person, we're not really addressing what the root cause of the issue is. And we're not building a system to deal with that. We are kind of band-aiding the situation. So I really like what you said there in terms of, how you guys are thinking about it and what you guys have seen. I mean, that's pretty incredible too. What would you say that, do you have any input in terms of what that increase was from? Was it just based on customer demand, and with the pandemic kind of coming as it did, that constant change, or do you have any other input on that?
I do, and as a precursor to that, one of the things that you just pointed out, Dave, I think is worthy of stressing, uh, specific to your point about adding more people, right? Ultimately, in order to improve any organization, you need to have the right combination. What is the synergy between your people, your processes, and technology? And so the traditional supply chain approach, as I mentioned earlier, is a very read and react type of approach. And so this leads to your question about what specifically precipitated that increase in PO change. And I think, at least from my experience, when we have unprecedented change and fear of the unknown, right, during the pandemic, at least for the beginning of the pandemic, what we were seeing is that the historical trends that were associated with the materials and services that were required fluctuated so greatly that those historical patterns really don't hold true anymore. And so a material requirements planning process will continue to generate demand signals, of course. And when you have firm demand for a product, you're going to get those signals and generate your purchase orders. But to account for any deviations from that demand plan, you talk about forecasting demand requirements, right? Those are fluctuating so greatly now as a result of fear and uncertainty in the economy, and companies' ability to fulfill, and other organizations were struggling, so their demand signals were being reduced significantly, and manufacturing and distribution companies were left trying to forecast what their demand is going to be. And so what many companies do in that type of scenario is they will either look to increase their safety stock to account for any new demand signals that are coming in. And oh, by the way, when you do that, right, when you're increasing your safety stock levels, you're tying up your working capital, right? So there are some business impacts that are associated with that. And so during that fear and uncertainty at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we were seeing significant fluctuations in demand. The historical demand signals were not there, so folks were using more manual approaches, right? We've got, here's our list of open orders, here's what we are expecting to see over the next 6 months, and how do we account for the delta? And so they're placing orders and canceling orders with suppliers, and so those changes were pretty frequent. And then if you take into account what most organizations are using today in terms of tools for that, yes, they're using their MRP planning tools inside of their ERP, enterprise resource planning environment. But then once those purchase orders are cut, they're relegated to using the phone and email and spreadsheets to update those details, right? And so the key to all of that is that not only do we need to be able to automate traditionally managed, manually managed processes, that's a necessary step for sure, but it's not sufficient. We need new and better ways to handle a digital transformation in the supply chain, taking those supplier stakeholders into account and providing a collaborative tool that enables those buyers and suppliers to communicate in real time. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing as we continue to navigate through the pandemic and beyond.
Yeah, I really appreciate you going a little bit deeper into that because, first off, one point that you made there that I think sometimes, you know, may get glossed over, but how relational all of this is, right? You make a move here, and what does it do over here? So just because you are, in your example, increasing your safety stock, you have to recognize what that's going to do from a cash flow standpoint. And the other big issue that we ran into from a supply chain standpoint in that particular scenario and throughout COVID, you don't know if that demand is going to continue to be there. So just because you're ramping up your safety stock levels and now you've impacted your cash flow, potentially you may be sitting on dead inventory.
Exactly.
It's a very tricky situation to navigate. I honestly don't envy anybody in supply chain management because it's just, it's one of those situations where, especially throughout that time, I feel like there was no right answer. It was just an answer. And then we continue to, go through this fine tuning process to try to navigate what everybody was going through.
Exactly right, and you're spot on. The interrelationship of on-time delivery performance from a supplier, which of course is the result of demand signals that are constantly changing for manufacturing and distribution companies, keeping track of all of those details, and then managing the results in terms of how that might impact a manufacturing or distribution company. Right? We talked about the revenue recognition, order protection. Right? If we're late from a supplier, all of the downstream impact that may have could result in some loss of revenue, or at least missing targets, right? You just don't have the visibility to that. But there are other negative consequences associated with late deliveries from suppliers, right? You also have the working capital challenge that I mentioned earlier, right? Most organizations are forced to increase their safety stock to account for potential stockouts. So working capital obviously is a litmus test for most organizations, right? We need to manage that to be successful. Another impact of a late delivery from a supplier that many organizations may not realize, or if they do, they consider it a cost of doing business, is that when we have late deliveries from a supplier, there are hard costs associated with that. So when we talk about, okay, we've expected to receive material for production and we didn't receive that material, now our production team has to be shuffled around so that we're working on other jobs potentially for which we do have material. Right. So there are costs associated with the reshuffling of our labor workforce. So that goes back to our earlier discussion about people, processes, and technology. Right. So in addition to that, when you consider in many cases late fees or penalties to the manufacturing company, I have some anecdotal experience associated with my days as a project manager. I was a project manager for a $200,000 terephthalic acid tank, pressure vessel, if you will, and titanium's quite expensive. But that wasn't the drawback for us. We received a penalty for late delivery of that unit. This happened to be for the Indonesian government at the time. This was early 90s, I guess. But the challenge was, after building this titanium tank, we were held up for a couple of days based upon stainless steel flanges, which we could have purchased down the street. And it just got missed in the supply chain. But it's evidence of the fact that if we don't have the product that we need, we can't ship product out the door, and there's a cost impact associated with that. So your comment about all of those moving parts having some interoperational impact, it never has that been more evident than it is today in a typical manufacturing and distribution environment. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're a global company, domestic company, large company, small company. All you need to do is turn on the news, and you're seeing some evidence of supply chain disruption today that is impacting and some industries, of course, are more impacted than others, but it is very wide ranging.
Yeah, completely agree with you there. Jim, take me through when you guys go into a company, and either that experience or in your past experience, what are some of the KPIs? What are some of the metrics that we can kind of look at and evaluate with the supply chain to see what areas potentially there are to move the needle for, from an improvement, efficiency standpoint, communication standpoint? What are some of those KPIs or metrics that you guys would typically look for?
Great question. And I think the granddaddy of them all, of course, is supplier on-time delivery performance, right? We have a commitment date that has been acknowledged, and we want to measure any deltas associated with that because of those downstream negative consequences potentially that we talked about earlier. But there are multiple metrics that go into that measurement, right? So you have not only your on-time delivery, but there may be some measurement associated with responsiveness for a supplier. If we have an initial demand signal that we're pushing to a supplier, we want to make sure that those suppliers are acknowledging the receipt of that demand signal. And then subsequently, any changes that might occur as a result of day-to-day business activities, right? So responsiveness is certainly going to be one element of that supplier scorecard, if you will. Price impact, that's another one that tends to move the needle a little bit, right? When we have over time, we want to be able to measure price fluctuation for different products so that we can potentially plan around that. If we see volatility for some of those items that we use on a frequent basis, giving our team more time to strategically look at ways to reduce the price is important for those types of items. And then, of course, quality of the product being supplied, that's a given today, right? There's so many folks just take that for granted, right? It's quality is quality. We expect quality, but we're going to measure against on-time delivery performance, right? So those are things that certainly every organization is going to have a need for. So it's an assumption that most companies make. I would think those are the needle movers, with the most important, of course, being on-time delivery, just because of it's so impactful in an organization in so many different areas. Revenue protection, cash flow optimization, preservation of working capital, of course, is another one, and then the order revenue protection.
I appreciate you going into that detail. And so it really prompts my next question, which was a bit of a setup. I'm not going to lie. It's a bit of a setup. But my question is,
how do I stay so good looking?
Well, obviously. But no, my question is, when you're going into these manufacturing facilities, a lot of times they don't have this much level of visibility, as you've just outlined. So what are the steps to help these companies get that visibility? What things from a detail perspective are you guys looking at to be able to gather that data and to help people really build an accurate picture of what's going on? So obviously you can then start to improve that process, build those relationships, and, increase the overall efficiency throughout the supply chain.
Great question, and that's one that I tend to spend quite a bit of time on when I engage manufacturing and distribution companies. In my experience, working with as many organizations as I have over the years, most manufacturing and distribution companies today have an ERP platform in place, a company that is, a solution that's designed to provide end-to-end capabilities for the industry they're in. And of course, there's a number of ERP platforms out there for different industries. Some are more generic, some are more specialized, but depending upon the company and industry you're in, you're going to have an ERP platform. That platform has different degrees of tools or solutions that they are suited to manage, right? They tend to be, for example, if you're in the distribution world, there are quite a few tools out there that help you manage distribution specific metrics, right? And it tends to be customer facing. How do we satisfy our customer base? And that's really the primary reason one ERP solution gets selected over another. It's based upon a company's ability to fulfill demand to their customers. What is less evident, and frankly, the investment in the supply side tends to be quite a bit lower. The value stream associated with the procure to pay process, which is just as important to most organizations as fulfilling demand to their customers, because you can't have one without the other. What those organizations do is they tend to look at, or companies in general tend to look at, okay, well, if we have a method of creating purchase orders, then we can fulfill our supply chain side of the equation. And what we're seeing, and this is evidenced by the fact that companies like SourceDay are purpose built to handle this niche, is the disconnect when the purchase orders are being generated from the ERP platform to the fulfillment, right? That buyer-supplier relationship, as I mentioned earlier, typically managed through spreadsheets, phone communication, and email. And so SourceDay sits between the buyer and the supplier in any of those ERP platforms to provide that high velocity communication, which translates to higher accuracy and ultimately enables us to satisfy some of those value stream items associated with revenue protection, cash flow optimization, working capital, as we mentioned earlier. And so I think as organizations look at their existing tools, and again, the combination of processes, people, and technology, if you look at ways to improve the communication between your buyers and your suppliers, you're going to inherently get more return from that relationship. So it's something, getting back to your initial question, most organizations do not measure things that are typically not leading directly to order fulfillment. But if you pull the string from order fulfillment, you see where that starts. In fact, I read an article recently, and I forget the source of the article, but one of the suggestions was to go back to how your suppliers communicate with their suppliers and look at the value stream from the origination of that raw material all the way through your organization. And when I sit down with manufacturing and distribution companies, I look at a few different things. I try to determine, number one, are you measuring today your supplier on-time delivery performance? And invariably, most organizations will say, well, we are looking at that. We really don't have a good way to measure it, but we know it's not 100%. And so that generally starts a conversation around, okay, well, how do we get to 100%? How do we increase the performance of those suppliers to help fix some of these negative consequences that you're experiencing? And so what I would typically do is I would engage in a business case analysis where we're looking at things like on-time delivery performance. How many purchase orders are you cutting per day, per week, per month, per year? What's the total direct spend in your organization, and how does that compare with your cost of goods sold? And you might ask, well, why does that matter when you're talking about a relationship between buyers and suppliers? But ultimately, it always comes down to business decisions. What is the impact that we're having on the organization? And if it's something that can be measured, it's something we can improve upon. And that's generally where I start those discussions, is because most organizations, they'll recognize that what they're doing is working to a certain extent, but they're not managing that to the level of being able to say, well, our supplier performance today is 97% and the business impact is this. And I try to help them understand what that the inability to manage that today and measure that effectively, how is that impacting their business? What is that costing their business in terms of monetized return?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, but to me, it falls under the category sometimes of you don't know what you don't know. And although on a surface level, they might understand or think that they understand what the impact is, until you really start to measure and really start to monitor, there is no way to aggregate that data to be able to have an accurate view of what the impact is. That said, once you get that data in front of you and you're able to aggregate it and to analyze it, it's pretty quick to see the improvements that are on the horizon for you by, more likely than not, implementing a tool or a process, a system, and it's going to be different for different size companies based on what you find with the data. But I would say that probably more times than not, the solution is going to be far simpler than the amount of impact that you can expect to see based on the implementation of the particular tool or process. So
couldn't agree more. And the lens, in my opinion, as a final comment on that topic, the lens through which we see the impact on the organization tends to be focused more on the customer facing side, because that is what is going to impact, and to a large extent it should be, right? We want to make sure that we're taking care of our customers, but not to the exclusion of being able to fix some of the back office challenges that we're experiencing that could help improve our delivery to our customers. And that is one of the things that many organizations with whom I engage don't recognize right away until we start peeling the onion back.
yeah, I mean, 100%, right? You said it earlier, and it kind of, begs to be reiterated, but you can't have one without the other. You can't deliver on the customer facing side if you've not addressed the supplier side, because from a manufacturing standpoint, you need those materials to come in to be able to satisfy your own customer demand. So that's a great way to kind of wind that up. And Jim, as we get ready to kind of land the plane here, I'd love to just get some closing thoughts in terms of, overall supply chain management, the challenges. We talked a lot about the KPIs and the things that are important, but if you had to sum this up for somebody, what would those kind of closing thoughts be?
Yep, and I like your analogy of landing the plane there. That's one of the things that when we kind of tying this back into an operations perspective. of which the supply chain typically rolls up in most manufacturing and distribution operations, right? It's the operational director of operations, VP of operations. Generally, they tend to have P&L responsibility for a given plant or an organization. Supply chain details roll up through that. And so when we talk to operations professionals, the general response that I hear is that it's a lot like flying a plane in a storm, right? We know we're in the air and we're moving in the right direction, but we really don't have full visibility of everything that's going on. And so when we talk about improvements to supply chain, we want to provide better visibility to what's happening in that supply chain as it applies to the demand and supply signals, right? And so that better collaboration, better communication between the buyers and suppliers is going to improve the on-time delivery performance. And I've heard, I think it might have been Tony Robbins that said, if you need to manage something, you need to measure it, right? And so not having those metrics in place today gives you some directional visibility, but in terms of hard cost numbers, when we talk about hard cost savings and top line revenue type measurements, we need to have something a little bit more concrete than that. And so the general consensus is that we need to provide some of the metrics that organizations need to improve upon supply chain so that they can ultimately experience some of those hard cost savings and higher delivery performance to their customers, because it is very much related.
Yeah, thanks for summing it up there. And that was a great segue. I didn't even know that I was putting it out there for you. So I appreciate that. Jim, if people want to find out more about SourceDay or connect with you, where's the best way for them to find you?
Certainly, www.sourceday.com. Visit our website. We've got some case studies out there and website blogs with customers that have leveraged our product and with a high degree of success. And then you can also find out about suppliers. One thing I didn't talk about in 20 seconds or less here is that one of the challenges that most organizations will have, one of the concerns that they have, is the supplier adoption. When we're talking about supplier collaboration, it's a two-way street, right? And we need to make sure that there's something in it for both the manufacturing and distribution companies and their suppliers. And so by visiting our website, you can see some examples of what's in it for the supplier, because there are benefits to them as well in terms of consolidating the demand signals that come in from their customers and responding to that in a single repository where they can see all of those demand sources in one place. So sourceday.com, certainly, if you're interested in reaching out to me, Jim Frye, Jim.Frye, Frye at sourceday.com is another way. Certainly, I'll be happy to return any inquiries that you might have.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jim. And I appreciate you going into that little part about, it was an important part. So I'm glad that you did mention it because to your point, it is a two-way street. And for all the listeners out there, I will make sure that we put Jim's contact information in the show notes for you to access very quickly. So Jim, thanks again so much for joining us on the Everyday Business Problems podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Chrysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Chrysler.